Hello everyone, welcome to the next video in this series going through the exercises from HSMA 6 session 1E. That was Python programming part 1. Now we're going to be going through exercise 3 next. Exercise 3 is the one that starts looking at a little bit of loops. So we're going to be doing a little bit with while loops, a little bit with for loops, and also using some of the skills that we've been building up in the previous 2 exercises. So printing, user input, F strings, bit of maths, etc. So I'm in VS Code. I have opened up the exercise 1E3 IPython notebook. If you want to know how to do this, how to get your VS Code set up like this, head back to the first exercise solution video. The beginning of that covers how to do this. You can also access this exercise via Google Colab. There will be a link in the video description. Now, just to give us a little bit more space, I'm going to click on this Explorer button to hide this side panel. We don't need that for the exercise now that we've got the exercise notebook open. So what have we got to do today? Task 1. Now, for those of you that have been following for a while, you'll be familiar with the fact that I like to break up these markdown tasks into slightly more readable steps. So I'm going to click on this markdown cell, I'm going to click edit cell, and I'm going to mess around with the formatting. So we want code that asks the user to, I'm going to put this on a new line, type a hyphen and a space to indicate to the markdown cell that we want this to be a bulleted list. So we want to input a number, and the machine prints out the times tables for whatever number is entered. We want to use the message format x times chosen number is result. So for example, 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, etc. So we're getting quite used to asking for user input at this point. So let's go for input number equals input. So input just asks the user for some input. Inside our brackets, we want to input a string, which is why I've got these 2 little quotation marks. And our string is going to basically be what the prompt to the user will be. So please enter a number. And what we're wanting to do with this number in a minute, we're going to be wanting to do some maths with this number. Now, you may remember that when we ask for an input using the input function of Python, what will get returned to us is a string. Now, you can't do maths with a string, so all we need to do is tell Python to please convert whatever the user enters into an integer. We're not going to be covering how to do the 3.5 times table, for example. In this, we are going to assume that the user will enter a whole number. And if they don't, then it will be truncated to the nearest whole number. So 3.5 will get turned into 3, for example. Now, so the machine, we want to print out the times table from 1 times up to and including 12 times for whatever number is entered. Now, this sounds like a great time to use a for loop. Now, a for loop, you can go back and watch the video specifically on for loops if you're not familiar with this, but just to recap, a for loop will iterate over a particular bit of code a certain number of times. So what we will do is we will enter for number in range. And what the range function does is just give us a counter, effectively. It will give us effectively a range object that goes from whatever number we specify to start on up to, but not including, the number we specify for it to end on. So let's go for number in range 1 to 13, because we've been asked for up to and including 12 times the number, and actually if we just do 1 to 12, because this second number isn't included, then we won't have enough numbers. I'll demonstrate that a bit more in a minute. But let's go 1 to 13, and just for now, I'm going to print x. No, I'm not going to print x because we don't know what x is. I'm going to print number. I'm going to get rid of this line a second just so we can focus on this little bit of the code. So for number in range 1 to 13, print number. Now, what's this going to do? Oh, and I've, as usual, I've forgotten to connect to my Python environment. If you're not sure about connecting to Python environments, do go back and watch one of the earlier videos, the solution videos in this series. I'm just letting it connect to our base kernel at the moment. And now we can see that we have got the numbers 1 to 12 printed out. So for number in range 1 to 13, print number. Now, if I was to change this to 1 to 12, then you could see that actually I'm not having much luck here. All I'm having is the numbers 1 through to 11, and that is because 12 is not included. I could also, so let's go back up to 113. I could also tell the range function to iterate by a different size of gap. So at the moment we're iterating by 1 each time. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I tell it I want to iterate by 2, then I get 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. And this is basically all you need to know about the range function. The number you start from, the number you end on, except it's not exactly the number end on, it won't be included, and then the number you want to iterate by. If you don't specify this, it will assume that you want to count up by 1 each time. So we're managing to print a number. That's all well and good. So this number is going to be, in our code, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, etc., if I could count. So what we need to do now is put back our input number. Please enter a number. And what we're going to do is we're going to times our input number by the number. So what we're going to end up is 1 times our input number, 2 times our input number, 3 times our input number, and so on. So this time I'm going to press play, and I'm going to ask for the 2 times table. So this, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. This all looks correct to me. If we enter a number, then I've put in 3 this time. We've got 3, 6, 9, 12, and that's because we're going 1 times 3, 2 times 3, 3 times 3, and so on. We're cycling through this code for each of these numbers in our range. Now, we've actually been asked to print this a little bit more nicely, so I'm going to head back to our trusty friend, the F string, the format string. Now, we want number. So we're going to say number times our input number is number times input number. So what we've got is we're saying I want you to print out the number. Again, remember this is our counting number from our range, so that will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on. Our input number, that will always be the number that we got our user to input at the start, and then we want to say is, and we want number times input number. We've done this calculation within our little curly braces. We could do it separately. We could go result equals number times input number, and then we could just say that we want this to be the result. The output would be exactly the same. It's just whether you want to store it separately, you might find it's a little bit more readable. It could be useful if you want to do something extra to it, or you want to use it in more than one place. There's not really a right or wrong answer here. It will depend a bit on how the code you're writing. So let's just check that this is all working. I'm going to ask for the 3 times table. 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, and so on. And I believe this is everything that we wanted from this bit of code. So, on to task 2. Again, write code that asks the user for a number to start from, and then prints a countdown from that number, printing each number each time until it reaches 0. I've indented here just so that this will be a sort of sub-bullet. Rather than printing 0, it prints Thunderbirds are go when we get to 0. So I think what we'll need to do here is, again, we'll have a for loop like before because we want to count down. We want also to have some conditional logic in there. So these are our if statements, our if and our else. Now, why do we want this? It's because when we are working with any number except 0, when our countdown is printing out anything except 0, we want to print out the number. However, when we get to 0, we want our code to do something different. So every time we are running our code, we need it to be checking, am I a number that is greater than 0 at the moment, or am I a number that is 0? And I want to act accordingly. Now, let's go back up and just copy our input number from the previous task, because again, we just need to ask the user to start from a particular number. And again, we're going to ask for an integer. We're not worrying about trying to count down to 0 from 4 3/4. That is beyond the scope of this exercise. So we will take whatever they enter and turn it into an integer. Now, we want a range again. So let's go for number in range. And this time we're going to use our input number as the start. So instead of specifying that we want to start from 1 or that we want to start from 7, we're going to say that we want to start from whatever number our user has entered. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is say what we want to count down to. Now again, you will remember from the previous exercise that the second number in our range function doesn't get included. So if we tell it to print from 1 to 12, we will only get actually 1 to 11. So we need to add 1 to whatever we want to input. However, this time we're counting down. So the last thing we want is 0. But if we tell it to go to 0, it will only go to 1. So actually we need to tell it we want to go as far as -1. And also, we need to tell it that we want to count backwards. So instead of counting up in 1, because that won't work in this case, because we're going from 7 or 8 or 10 or whatever, down to 0, effectively, if we just try and run this actually by default, let's see what happens. Let's just go print number. So at the moment, we'll enter an input number, but it'll be completely ignored because we haven't, well, it won't be ignored, it will be our starting number. And you can see actually we've got nothing. Nothing has printed out. We haven't had an error, but that's because basically it's trying to count upwards and end on -1, and this is all just confusing things a little bit. Let's instead try asking it to count down by 1, which we tell it to do by saying, please do this, please count down by -1. Let's see what happens this time. So I'm going to enter 5 again, and this time you can see we've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Again, just to illustrate, if we'd entered 0 as our end, then actually we would have just got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we're missing our final step of the count. So we've done half the task, but now we need to print Thunderbirds a go when we get down to 0. So what we're going to do is, if our number is greater than 0, then we're going to print the number. Else, we're going to print Thunderbirds our go. And it's that simple. All we do every time we run through this loop of the code, so every time we get a new number from our range, we go, right, let's start at 5. And is this number bigger than 0? Yes, it is. So we're going to print the number. And then actually, because that condition was triggered, this else will be ignored. It doesn't matter. We've hit a condition that works. That's all we need. So next, we are then it's going to go down. It's going to count down by 1. Our next number is going to be 4. And then it's going to go, is 4 greater than 0? Yes, it still is. Great. When we get to our last number, which will be 0, remember I haven't rerun this since I fixed this back to be the correct ending number, it will go, is this number greater than 0? No, it's not. It is 0. So let's go to our else statement. Print Thunderbirds a go. So I'm going to enter 5 again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Thunderbirds a go. Bam. That's exercise 2, task 2 done. So on to the next one. You're getting very familiar with this pattern now. Code below contains an import of the random library. Now the random library is a really useful one. You will find yourself, especially in our discrete event simulation module, you'll need lots of random numbers generating. There's various points throughout your Python coding career where you will want to either generate a random number or you will want to choose a random selection from a list, for example. So in this case, what we've got also contains a line of code that shows you how to use the random library to randomly select an integer between 1 and 10 and store this as a variable. Excellent. So we want to add this code cell. We want to store a variable named number of fives that is initially set to 0 and will act as a counter. Okay. Then we want to get the computer to keep randomly selecting a number between 1 and 10, printing the number that it picks, and so we get the computer to keep randomly selecting a number between 1 and 10, printing the number it picks, and checking whether the number is a 5. If it is a 5, say that let's get it to print a message that says it's found a 5 and increase the counter up to 1. The computer should keep doing this until it finds 5s, at which point it will declare that Johnny 5 is alive and the code will end. Right, if I click stop editing cell, we can see that we've got a little bit more of a recipe to follow. So first, let's just print out this random thing. Let this random underscore number that Dan has kindly given us. So import random, print random number. So what has happened, we've run rand int from 1 to 10. So we want a number between 1 and 10, and it's going to print a random number for us. If I run it again, we get 2, 4, 10. So actually that tells us that the number can be as big as 10, unlike when we were doing our range a minute ago. This number is included as one of the possibilities. Let's keep going. 6, 2, 3, 9, 2, 3, 6, 2, 1. So again, we can see now that 1 is also one of the possibilities. So every time this code runs, the line random number, random int, we get a new random number that we can use. So what did we need to do? We wanted a variable called number of fives that will be a 0. And I'm going to add a comment here saying initialize a variable used as a counter. Not been very good at adding comments so far, but we should do it a little bit more. So now we're going to use a different kind of loop. We've been using for loops so far. Now this time we're going to use a while loop. Again, if you're not familiar with while loops, I'd recommend you go back and watch the HSMA video on while loops. But just to recap, a while loop will keep running until some condition is met. So in this case, we want the while loop to keep running until we have 5 fives in our list. So, or not even 5 fives in our list actually, we have found 5 fives. So let us choose. So we want to do a while loop. So while the number of fives is less than 5, so up until the variable number of fives is equal to 5, then we're going to keep running whatever is inside this indented block of code. So again, remembering that and I didn't cover this before actually, I'm very sorry. Going back to our for loop, so everything where it's indented will be part of the for loop. Same is true of our while loop. So everything that is now in this indented block of code will run will run as part of the while loop. So until this condition here, until number of fives is until this condition is no longer met, so when number of fives is equal to 5 or greater than 5, it won't get to greater than 5 in this case, but just, that is part of the condition, this code will keep running. So let's get random number out of here and pop it in here instead. I'm going to get rid of that. So, while number of fives is 5, please generate a new random number. If the random number that we have generated is 5, then we want two things. We want to print found a 5, and we want number of 5s is equal to whatever the number of 5s, however many 5s we had before, plus 1, because if this bit of code has been triggered, then that must mean we found a 5, so we want to add 1 to our counter. Now, we don't actually need an else here, but we do need to print out what the random number was, because we were asked to do that. Regardless of what the number was that was picked, then it will print 5. So you can see, unlike our thing earlier where we had else, we don't have an else here, and that's perfectly fine. And you can have an if statement that doesn't have an else clause. So what are we going to do? The other thing, we are going to exit our while loop. So this code will keep running and we'll be stuck inside this loop until we have 5 5s. And just to make this a little bit easier, it's not what we've been asked for, but I'm also going to add an extra little bit that says print you have found number of 5s so far, just so we can keep track of how many 5s we've got at different points in the code. Outside of our while loop, so once we have exited our loop because we have found 5 5s and our number of 5s counter is now equal to 5 or above, but in this case, once we hit 5, then we'll exit the loop so it can't get higher than 5. But we are now going to print Johnny 5 is alive. Right, let's print this. So what has happened here? 10 4 1, so it's printing out our random numbers, and then we got 5. It said found a 5, and we found 1 5 so far. Keep going, we found another 5 after running lots of different random numbers. We've got 2 5s, and let's turn it into a scrollable element. I don't have that turned on by default. So now let's go back up to the top. We already looked at that. 2 5s. We had to generate quite a lot of random numbers this time before we found 5. Now we found 3 5s. Found another 5. Kept going. Found a 5. You found 5 5s. At that point, we exit out of our while loop because Johnny 5 is alive. And that's all of the tasks in this exercise.